consultation on a once-in-a-generation review of the Law Society kicked off last week and must result in a new independent regulator being set up for the profession, Hamish McNicol writes in this week's Shoeshine. So what is this once-in-a-generation review all about?
So this has been bubbling away for a little while. It sort of comes on the back partly of the whole Russell McVeigh incident from 2018. Basically there was a lot of scrutiny about how the Law Society had handled some of those complaints, whether it was even fit to handle some of those complaints. And so over the years since, we've obviously had a couple of pretty high-profile reviews, Dame Margaret Baisley, there's a Dame Sylvia Cartwright review as well. And they've made a whole bunch of recommendations about how the society and law firms could better handle these sorts of issues. And so sort of middle of last year, they commissioned a pretty wide-ranging independent review of its structure, its functions, basically anything and everything to do with the regulation of lawyers and legal services in the country. That panel has 3 people on it, including former Ombudsman Ron Patterson, Jacinta Ruru and Jane Mears. And basically they've now, just last week, published a 34-page discussion document which sort of lays out what are the areas they're looking at and what they want feedback on.
So tell me, what are some of the most significant options on the table?
So one of the things that the discussion document really dives into is the complaints process and how broken it is, really, to be frank. The Law Society, on average, receives nearly 1,500 complaints a year, but close to 90% of those are dismissed with no action. There's also taking a long time to handle these complaints, so sort of 259 days on average to resolve a complaints that then go up to the disciplinary tribunal, another 100 or so days on top of that, if not more. And also in the last few years as well, past 10 years, there's been 1,750 instances of unsatisfactory conduct findings, but they've only disclosed the lawyer's name in 62 of those cases. So this has all led to, basically it's a slow process. It takes a long time for complaints to feed through. And also that has led to this sort of perception of a bit of a conflict of interest. The society is run by lawyers for lawyers. It's pretty unique amongst professions in New Zealand for a professional body, representative body, to also be the regulator of itself. I think teachers is the only other one that's pointed to in the discussion document that was released last week. So there's a whole lot of things going on. Resourcing is a big thing. They have 22 standards committees, which are made up of lawyers and lay people who assess these complaints. But the way that the legislation is sort of drawn up at the moment, every single complaint has to go to a standards committee, which obviously draws out the process a long time. These people are volunteers as well. So the Law Society, in fairness, has been pushing for change in that area. They want, the capability to be able to sort of triage complaints and immediately get rid of the frivolous ones, which obviously there will be from time to time. So on the back of all of that, and in that context, one of the major recommendations that they make is for this idea of establishing an independent regulator. And Patterson, the chair of the thing, said the legal profession is currently regulated by the Law Society. However, it is also a membership body for lawyers with a duty to promote the interests of its members. This conflict of interest is unusual, and a number of overseas jurisdictions have recognised this and created an independent entity. And that's sort of the thing that stuck out to me most in this, is this idea of establishing an entirely new independent regulator for the profession.
And who would that be? What kind of person would it be?
So, for instance, in the UK, which has still sort of a joint model, sort of, but they've split it out. So there's the Law Society in the UK, but there's also a thing called the Solicitors Regulation Authority as well, which is just solely charged with the regulatory stuff.
Right.
The issue there, and that the split between those two there, was sort of a very drawn-out, controversial process. Part of that is because the regulatory functions of law societies are generally the bigger part of these organisations. Practicing certificate fees are what are generated by the regulatory arm. And so when the Law Society and SRA were splitting off, the Law Society was losing a big chunk of funding. And so that led to all sorts of issues. So the SRA in the UK is still sort of technically under the group of the Law Society, but it's now, just as of last year or the year before, fully established as a separate legal entity. So it would involve, and the discussion document itself says it does involve a lot of cost, a lot of time. It's not an easy thing to do. You would have to set up this whole other body. But it has been done and is increasingly the direction of travel overseas as well.
So could it not be appointed by the government and paid by the Ministry of Justice? It has to. Does it have to come from lawyers?
It could come
themselves?
from that. It could come from that avenue. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So how has the industry reacted to this?
Well, interestingly, I sort of put the feelers out amongst the profession this week. Also, tried to talk to the society and the independent panel as well. Everyone's sort of sitting pretty tight, really. You can sort of understand why the society or the panel wouldn't want to, discuss much further in advance of receiving submissions. But I maybe expected a few of the firms to come out with some firmer ideas around this sort of stuff. But the reaction I got from one pretty prominent firm was, we're watching this with interest, but we're also just sitting tight to see what happens. And given, we've heard phrases like this is a once-in-a-generation review and all these sorts of things, you would think that there would be slightly more active sort of campaigning, particularly on something as big as this. There's also some stuff in there about basically opening up the profession to allow non-lawyers to provide legal services.
Lawyers aren't going to like that, are they?
Well, no, exactly. And you'd think that they would be talking about that a bit more. So in the UK, again, there's a thing called alternative business structures, which is basically companies which provide legal services but are also allowed to get outside investment, lists on the stock exchange, all those sorts of things, which is really complicated, but you can't do that here in New Zealand. And we saw just last week as well, Watton & Kearney, an Australian headquartered firm with a New Zealand base as well. The Aussie parent was able to disclose that it had received an investment from a private equity firm, but it doesn't affect the New Zealand arm at all because it's not allowed to. So something like that, if it does get recommended and changes are made in that area, could have pretty significant ramifications down the road.
The kind of silence and the opaqueness kind of goes to the original point of setting it up, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, exactly. And sort of feeds into, this is exactly why. Just make it cleaner. It's awkward. There's no allegations here that there's inherently a conflict there, and that this does mean that things aren't getting done properly. But it's just unmanageable. It's really difficult to be the representative body and also the regulator. Yes. So let's just make it cleaner.
Indeed. And so finally, what's next?
So consultation runs over the next couple of months. There's a couple of webinars if you want to tune into one of those next month.
I'm sure you will be.
And then basically the idea is to present their recommendations to the board of the Law Society by the end of the year. And then from there, they then take it back to the government, and we'll see what changes shake out on the back of that.
Thanks very much, Hamish.